Hello and welcome to episode 18 of In True Death Theatre in the Making podcast. I'm your host, Remi Rachuba, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, as you might remember in episode 17, I was talking about looking for a producer and what I did and how I did it and where I looked for a producer, which wasn't a very easy thing to do, but I was plowing through. But also I became aware of the fact that, 2019 was not going to be the year that I wanted it to be. Certain creatives left the project, which was fine, and I needed to look for someone else, and that was the producer. But it was a very hard thing to do. So we're going back, I think it was June 2019. I'm sitting in Look Mum No Hands, one of my favorite, if not the favorite, coffee place in London. And I was feeling very helpless. I didn't know really what to do, and my search was going nowhere. And once again, I emailed all my friends and colleagues, who work with various people. Maybe they would know someone who could help me produce my piece, because I always think that it's good to go to people that you know. And then all of a sudden, I got an email, and that email was from Ed Littlewood. And Ed Littlewood is a producer, and he is based in England and in Scotland. And you might remember him. I worked with him in 2011 when I was doing a rehearsed reading at the Travers Theatre in Edinburgh. And then we bumped into each other at Fringe 2012, where Ed told me about the restorative justice system, and it became part of my piece. So then I got an email from Ed, and Ed said, okay, why don't we talk about it? And we did. We spoke on the phone in 20 minutes. And I remember when I spoke to Ed, the very first thing he said to me was, Remi, how can I help you? And I spilled the beans, and I told him about funding and things that I didn't know what to do and how confused I was. And I remember Ed asked me again and said, so Remi, how can I help you? And then I just knew that this conversation was so going to be business-like, and I wasn't particularly ready for that conversation, but there was no escape from it. I just needed to face and just say it as it was. And I just said, listen, Ed, I'm looking for someone who can write my funding application, but I don't have the money, but I'm looking for someone and I really don't know what to do. So I actually said it. I said it as it was. And then Ed said to me something that really kind of changed everything for me. And Ed said, you know what, Remi, I'm not going to write your funding application, but what we can do is I can actually maybe look at your application when you write it. Maybe we can, arrange something, you can pay me, and over a couple of days I can do that. And that was something that I was not even aware of that people actually did. I don't know, I think probably it shows that I was completely new to all of it. I didn't even know that people would do something like that. I thought that people can either write your funding application or not. I actually didn't know that people can even work on an application for example, a couple of days and give you some kind of notes. I didn't even know that, but it was very promising. It was very good news, and I could afford it. And yes, that conversation uplifted me a lot. And I felt very, very positive about it because I saw some kind of light in the tunnel. But that conversation made me realize a couple of things. And one of them was the fact that all of a sudden I had to do something that I had been dreading for a very long time. Well, just the thought of it, I was dreading the thought of it, but which was writing that Arts Council England application. I didn't want to do it, but then Ed said it, and it kind of, well, there was no way around it. I had to do it. I had to write it, which I had been thinking that, it's a possible scenario. But that day, it was quite clear. And also, I was thinking, you know what? If I'm not going to do it, nobody's going to do it for me. So that was quite clear. The other thing was that, I had Ed on board, and I was quite happy that there would be someone who would be looking at my application and, look at what I've written, because I always think it's important to write something and maybe ask someone else to look at what you've written, especially as I had never written a funding application, and I kind of felt that I was in a good company, so someone was looking after me. That's very, very important for anyone who had never written a funding application. The final thing that I all of a sudden began to realize was the fact that I was becoming the producer of my work, which I think is very, very important, because all the work that I had been doing by that time, I was literally contacting creatives, talking about money, thinking of venues, which actually producers do. But I didn't know that. It kind of started to dawn on me when I began writing my funding application that I think I'm becoming the producer of my work, which I think is crucial, because I thought, well, if it's my work, why wouldn't I make a decision about my work? I think it's obvious. So there were quite a few things that I was really pleased with. And on top of that, Ed said to me, you know what, Remi, if you need any help, let me know. I can email you some budgets, some Excel sheets from my previous productions, and you can have a look at how I went about certain things, which was extremely, extremely helpful. So that was that day when I felt very elated. And in hindsight, I think, you know what? It's great to ask people for help. It's okay. I didn't know anything about it. Why wouldn't I ask someone to help me with something? It's fine. I felt very helpless, but then all of a sudden, from that feeling of kind of being stuck, I found some kind of a resolution, or I found some kind of solution to the way I was feeling. And after I left that coffee shop, I knew what to do and what my next step would be, which was preparing and, writing my Arts Council England application. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on in this episode is kind of talking about funding and how I prepared for Arts Council England funding. And I'm going to talk about timing and how to kind of plan the application. And I'm only going to talk about my experience, maybe for someone who is listening who has written funding application is going to be different, but back in the day, and that was about 2 years ago, I had never written a funding application, so it was all new. So whatever I'm talking about may be different to some other people who have more experience, and maybe this is going to be helpful to people who had never written a funding application, just to give them some kind of an idea of how it worked for me and what I needed to bear in mind when I was writing my funding application. So when I was writing my application, and that was, I actually started about 2 years ago, that was June of 2019, so kind of when this episode is released, I gave myself some time to write the application, and I gave myself 3 months to write it. I was working, as I was saying, I was working as an interpreter, I was working for the computer game, I was working for the children's home for autistic children, so it wasn't that I was just focusing on my application. And the 3 months that I had, I thought, okay, you know what? I'm planning to write my application in that time. And I always think it's good to have a lot of time to prepare it and plan your project. Because when I started writing my application that was June 19, I was planning to do my tour in April, May. So that was quite a long time. And someone may be thinking, wow, Remi, that's actually quite a long time. It's just too much. But I can explain how I went about it and why it took me such a long time, which actually worked for me perfectly. So the 3 months planning and writing the application. Now, of course, I was, filling in all the boxes and writing and, also contacting venues, because in the end, I concluded that I really needed to write my application, and I concluded that it's going to be a tour, that I'm going to go on a tour with my solo piece. And what it means is that when you are filling in the application, you need to put the various venues where you're going to present it. You not only write the venues, but you need to provide the details, the dates, the contact information of the theatre, of the person that you are talking to, and you need to write whether that date is confirmed or penciled, and it's always good to have as many confirmed as you can. Because that means that the project is more realistic rather than just, writing penciled. So I used the 3 months to write it, to contact various venues, and I'm going to talk about it in a couple of minutes when I finish talking about the timing and how long it took me. So that was it. And then I set myself a deadline, and I think it's always very, very important to have some kind of a deadline for a project. And I was talking about different deadlines before with playwriting competitions. Here, my deadline was my holidays. So I kind of knew, okay, before I go on holiday, I need to send, for example, my application to Ed. And I was going to Croatia at the end of August, so I was thinking, wow, okay, before I go, I need to send it to him so that he can have a look at what I've written, and then he can give me some notes about it. And I always think it's great to have a deadline before you go somewhere. That works in my case. So, for example, I was going to Croatia. My deadline was before I went to Croatia. And then again, when I was going for Christmas, we were going skiing in Austria. I had my deadline before I went, because I always think that, I want to have it done before I go, because actually I don't want to go, on holiday thinking about my application, because a holiday or a break is to have a break rather than just going skiing, and then when I'm on a lift skiing in Austria, at the back of my head there is the thought of, oh my god, I need to do my ACE. Well, it doesn't work for me. And actually the other thing that is important is that even before I go on holiday and I submit, that's already working in my favor, because then when I resubmitted my application, because my first application was rejected and then I needed to resubmit, and I resubmitted it before Christmas, Arts Council England is already processing my application. So that's already 2 weeks in my favor, rather than me coming back from skiing and then resubmitting and wasting 2 weeks. I think it's a waste of time. This is my approach. Then in September, I was planning to look at the notes that I got from Ed. But what happened was, in the meantime, I was told that I could meet with a relationship manager from Arts Council England. And I got that appointment in August. So when Ed was looking at my application and the budget, and that was when I was in Croatia, the second half of my stay over there, I needed to look at the application because I knew that the appointment with the relationship manager was coming. And I normally wouldn't be looking at work-related stuff, but because that appointment was so important, I just needed to say, you know what, I need to do it because I really want to go to that meeting very well prepared. And it went really, really well. The relationship manager was extremely helpful, and yes, and it allowed me to put the final touches to the application, which I finally submitted the end of October, because there was still a couple of things that I needed to do, and life goes on. That weekend when I was to submit my ACE application, it was the busiest weekend I had in a very long time. The computer game that I was working for, they were releasing a new game, so I needed to be online Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I was working on a research and development project in Canterbury on Saturday and Sunday. So it was mental. It was absolutely mental. When I was submitting it on the 28th, that was, I think, on a Monday, it was just going through the application and reading it because, the application was ready, and sometimes you just need to give it a little bit of time to rest and come back to it. And the decision came on the 3rd of December and it was negative. So then what did I do next? I already took it into consideration, the fact that, my first application may be unsuccessful. So why don't I have extra time to resubmit? And this is what I did. Within the next 2 weeks, I worked on the application and I resubmitted. And what that means is that you literally need to, fill in a new application online. In my case, it was just literally copying and pasting. Of course, when you've got that decision letter, it tells you which sections of the application are not as well developed as other ones. So they told me that I needed to work on my engagement section. So when I was resubmitting, I kind of amended these bits and actually included the bits on the rehearsed reading that I did at the Dragon Cafe, and that was very, very helpful because in the end I got the funding. But I also got in touch with the venues and I told them about it, and I said, listen, the thing is that I didn't get the funding, so I'm resubmitting. And certain venues said, you know what, it's fine. And certain venues, I think 2 or 3, said, listen, Remi, we need to know about your funding by mid-January. And I said, listen, I will know at the end of January. And they said, sorry, it's too late for us. We need to put in the program. So that's also important, and that's also worth bearing in mind, that when you are contacting various venues, they need to put your project in their program. They need to program it. So that's why it's crucial for anyone to get in touch with the venues quite early so that they can do the planning. And they normally plan the programs, their programs quite far in advance. So it should be a transparent process, to be quite honest. And it's also important to let them know that you got the funding and you didn't get the funding, so they are aware of it, and they can pull out. Fortunately or luckily, most of the venues said, you know what, Remi, it's fine. So this is what happened in the 2-week window before I resubmitted on the 18th of December, just before I went skiing to Austria. The decision came on the 27th of January. and it was successful. So I was so happy because it actually meant that I would be doing the project. Now, coming back to the timing of the project. Now, what's really, really important when anyone is working on the funding application, I'm only talking about Arts Council England. I'm not really sure how it works with other funding bodies. They also want you to write, the start date for the project. And my start date for the project was the 10th of February. So the funding came through the end of January and the project was starting the 10th of February. So kind of 2 weeks from the decision letter. Now, what's also important to bear in mind is the fact that when you get the decision letter, the money doesn't come through immediately. You kind of need to wait about 3 weeks before you get the money. If you don't have certain payment conditions or payment requests, like it was in my case. So I needed to provide them with my bank details, and I think I needed to send them some information by post, but I also needed to provide some evidence that I was going to do my crowdfunding campaign. You only receive 90% of the money initially, and then when the project is over, you receive the remaining 10%. Now, Arts Council England should make a decision on your application within 6 weeks. I'm not sure what it is at the moment. I've heard that it's 10 weeks because they've got so many applications. But for an application that is under £15,000, it takes them I think even less than 6 weeks, because the decision letter, when I counted the days, it wasn't even 6 weeks. In my case, it was 5 weeks. The other thing that I really wanted to focus on is start date on your application, because someone may be thinking, oh, you know what, I'm putting in my application and then 6 weeks, so then we are starting our project. Well, what does it mean to start your project? What does it mean, start date? What is it? I didn't know it at the very beginning. I thought, maybe it means rehearsals, maybe it means the tour. No, it actually means when you are starting to have conversations with the designer, when you are sending, tour packs or press releases. That's actually when you are working on your project. So this is what I put as my start date. Start date is not the date when you start rehearsals. No, actually the project starts quite earlier than that. So it's worth remembering that, when you are planning your project, you plan it well, because you get the decision letter and then you need to have some time before you actually have your start date. If it's too tight, Arts Council England could say to you, the project is not well planned. This is at least what I was told. I think it may be different with resubmissions because they know that you are resubmitting, so they may look at it in a different way. But still, in my case, I had a 2-week window before I got the letter and then the start date of my project, which was actually the very first thing that I had was conversation with the designer. Of course, I had discussed the project with the designer, but then you actually put it on the application. And then, of course, I had sending tour packs to the venues, and then press releases, rehearsals in March, and then actually doing the tour in April and May, with the project finishing end of May. So kind of when you now look at it, when I started working on the application in June 2019, performing it, that was to take place April and May, and this is why it took me such a long time to do it. And it worked for me, for the person who had never submitted a funding application before, and I just think it's important to give yourself a lot of time, even more time that you can, because you never know what other things can come your way. There could be another artistic project, that something, just life goes on. And I think it's always good to have more time than less time, and maybe even have extra time for a resubmission like it was in my case. And maybe it's going to be useful to any writer, performer, actor like myself who wants to submit their first Arts Council England application without paying someone or a producer loads of money to do that. Now, the other thing that I really wanted to focus on is, like, where did I actually start? How did I know about what kind of an application I wanted to submit? So when I was, I had Ed on board and he was to help me with the application. But initially I was thinking, okay, I mean, where, do what, how? So as I was saying, I had this kind of an idea that it would be a tour. And this was stemming from the fact that I had these two versions of my solo piece, and there was an English version and a Polish version. And I was thinking, you know what, I've got this Polish version, and well, I would love to present it to the Polish people living in the UK. And this is why this idea of a tour came about, because I thought, you know what, if I want to present it to them, I would need to go to them. I would need to show them the piece. So the only way that I can do it is to go on a tour with it. So I knew that, Polish people live everywhere. And I was aware of the fact that, okay, people live here, people live there, that's fine. But then how do I go about and find out where to show it, like what venue? And I kind of didn't know that. And I was looking at another show, Polish show that was touring at that time. That was 2019, and that was by a colleague of mine, Margo Przymierska, and she did a solo show called Wedding Wesele. So I emailed her, I met with her, and she was very generous, and she said to me, listen, you know what I did? I looked at the venues within these communities, and I thought, oh, right, yeah, well, makes sense. And she actually recommended two venues, which I contacted. And this is how it really started. So then I looked back at the communities closer, like where Polish people lived, and identified these places. So, for example, Bognor Regis, Luton, Manchester, some places in London, East London, and then I looked at the venues, kind of pub theatres that are within these communities. And by that time, I actually knew that my solo piece works best in an intimate venue, so I was looking for venues like that. And it was very, very interesting, because when I contacted the venues, I emailed them and I told them of the piece, and that I have an English version and a Polish version. And all of them said, you know what, we only want a Polish version. We don't want the English version, just the Polish version. Which then kind of made sense, because I thought, well, you know what, yes, these venues are close to my community. But then when I was doing research into, Arts Council England application, they talk a lot about liaising with local communities. And I thought, wow, this would be perfect, because, when venues want to liaise with their local communities, but well, if we don't provide them with any opportunities, how can they do that? So this is when I was thinking, this is great, because maybe this is how it should go. Maybe I should be focusing more on these Polish communities, because this is the way I can get the funding. And I think out of the 15 shows that I had planned, 11 of them were to be in Polish, because that's what the demands of the venues were. which was great, but I was only finding out when I was emailing the venues. I knew about liaising with local communities, but then I also thought, you know what, it's also ticking the boxes, because the venue needs to tick the box that there are liaising with local communities, but they can't do it until they've got the right show. And I was coming to them with a Polish version of a solo piece, and they were saying, you know what, we want it. So maybe for any writer, creative, actor, performer, producer, especially international, I think we can't forget the fact that, you know what, there are local communities. And if you're looking for funding, maybe that's how it should be done. Maybe do it through in this way, liaise with your local communities, and that's how the funding will come through. And when I look at the venues, I had, I think, 11 or 13 to begin with, and initially I thought, wow, that's really not a lot. But then when I spoke to other people, people said to me, Remi, it's a lot. Don't feel that, you know what, I've got only 3 or 4 venues. No, well, these 3 or 4 venues will get you the funding. And if you don't do it, you will never know. And we learn by doing. That's how I feel about things. Learning by doing. That's how I learned. And that works for me. Like I was saying in the previous episode, I was learning to swim by myself. I threw myself in water and I was learning to swim by myself. And I was kind of, well, I was making some progress, to be quite honest, and that funding application was a big bulk of it. Well, a big bulk of my success. But I will talk about the Arts Council England application in episode 20, because in episode 19, I will be speaking to Ed Littlewood, who is my co-producer on Intruder, like I spoke to Marcus Montgomery Roche in episode 14. So until then, stay well, stay safe, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now.